Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Friends, today I'll be making a presentation on totalitarian state, and this time I'll be talking about two specific forms of totalitarian states which came into prominence after the First World War, and that was the Fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. The concept, its doctrine, its underlying principles, and its leadership and the reasons for its rise. These are the certain subheadings between which we'll be studying the concept of totalitarian state, part 2. So, totalitarian state had manifested in previous century in as a fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, and also communism in erstwhile USSR. All the three versions of totalitarian state had emerged around and after the First World War. It had been a tragedy of human life that all the three forms were heinous, anti-democratic, oppressive, reactionary, anti-revolutionary, but claimed themselves to be revolutionaries. So, as Epstein observes, that stripped to its essentials, fascism is the totalitarian organization of government and society by a single party dictatorship, intensely nationalistic, racialist, militarist, and imperialist. So, fascism represents a complete repudiation of the assumption, ideals, and methods of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. Liberalism and democracy look to the interest of the individual. Socialism looks to the interest of an economic class. For fascism, society is the end, individuals the means, and its whole life consists in using individuals as instruments for its ends. So the ideology of fascism is dominated by the dogmas of a state and an irresistible government which has the right to interfere in all spheres of individual life, whether economic, moral, religious, or civil. So civil life, according to the fascist creed, begins with the state, and all are in the state, and no one outside the state. So all commands are to be given by the state itself, and it commands all, and it is essence of state to govern. So a citizen's obligation to the state are more important than his rights. Fascism proclaims the rights of state, preeminence of its authority, and the superiority of its ends. No aspect of social life escapes the discipline of fascism. It repudiates pacifism and glorifies war. So, war, said Mussolini, alone brings up to its highest level the nobility or the human energy, and people should have courage to meet it. Thus, a doctrine which is founded upon this harmful postulate of peace is hostile, and it is hostile to mankind, and this is fascism. So let's trace the rise of fascism in Italy. So fascists first emerged in Italy in with the critical period immediately after the Great War of 1914 to 18, that is First World War. So Italy at that time experienced the worst characteristic features of post-war economic disorganization. There was gross profiteering, inconceivable inflation, soaring prices, and strikes for higher wages to meet the rising cost of living, and deficit budgets, unemployment of the war-weary soldiers. So Italy, though victorious in war, was diplomatically defeated, and her gains from the spoils of the war were not commensurate with her sacrifices. And Italy had consequently to withdraw her delegation from the Paris Peace Conference. So it was in these critical times that Mussolini, with his fascist creed, stepped in to rescue Italy from collapse. So it is beyond question that fascism changed Italy. In 1929, 7 years later, Mussolini, as head of the fascist government, boastfully spoke of an immense panorama of material and moral transformation which he had accomplished. So fascism gave to Italy a strong and centralized government which exacted disciplined obedience from her people and established her international reputation as a first-rate power. It ended the war between the labor and capital, which beyond which before the rise of Mussolini to power had threatened to plunge Italy into chaos. So there was a phenomenal development of Italy's industrial and especially agricultural resources. Finally, fascism taught the meaning of nationalism to Italians and inspired them with a new faith in new idea. So that was the rise and the structure which they created. The structure was on the line with the famous quote, that is when Mussolini was undergoing a march on Rome. Mussolini accepted the allegiance of king and became the premier. And for a brief period, he made some attempts to preserve the institutions and practices of parliamentary government. But Mussolini made it clear from the very beginning that he would not ignore his own ambitions, and he would ignore parliament, in fact, if it were uh, held him from pursuing his extraordinary powers and his demand to run the government. So meanwhile, opposition outside the legislature was being crushed by repressive governmental measures and by the violent acts of fascist armed squads. In January 1925, Mussolini broke away from the constitutional system and governed Italy by decree, which gave legal forms to the fascist policies and in achieving complete political centralization and absolutism. In November 1926, all opposition parties were dissolved. Then prison sentences were provided to those who tried to revive the parties or who carried on the propaganda for their doctrine. Now, by other decrees, the responsibility of Ministry of Parliament was abrogated. The king formally remained the constitutional head of the state, but the real head of the government was the premier with full authority to issue decrees having the force of law. And ministers uh, were not colleagues but his subordinates now. They were appointed by the prime minister and were individually and collectively responsible to him. So Italy, thus, like Russia, became a one party state, and nationalist fascist party like the Russian Communist Party was a closed corporation, hierarchically organized, and members were admitted to the party only after tests as their fascist character and loyalty. They were to take an oath to follow without question the orders of the deuce. Having created the fascist party, wrote Mussolini, I always dominated it. The party and the government had given to Mussolini, in brief, a carte blanche, that is, complete control. So it was his party and his government throughout Mussolini's autobiography. There are assertions of my command, my guidance, my sense of balance, my judgment, my irresistible domination. So that was the level of structure they had created. And if we talk about the fascist policy, we can say like the restoration of the power of Italian national externally and the establishment of vigor in the domestic administration of economic and civil affairs. Mussolini and his counselor had always believed that the prestige and influence of the state require an assertive foreign policy and a rigidly hierarchical organization of domestic government. For the realization of these aims, the fascists recognized no individual liberties as sacred. They instead relied upon the methods of moral intimidation, physical compulsion, official propaganda. But in their activities before seizure of formal power, in their subsequent government policy, the fascists dealt summarily and malevolently with their opponents. Unprecedented repressive methods were explicitly adopted, embodied in the wars and decrees of 1925 and 1926. So it was a punishable crime to criticize government, to conduct propaganda for the doctrine, and parties dissolved by government to spread false and exaggerated news abroad concerning internal condition of the country. So there was a rigid control of all published opinion. The law required every newspaper and other periodical to be operated under the control of a dictator approved by the government, and then that approval was not always coming if the opinion was not in line with what the dictator commanded, and limited the contributor to persons registered by government-controlled syndicates of journalists. So the governments had vigorously prosecuted and suppressed socialist liberal periodicals and had uh, made it fascist the more mildly critical journals, forcing replacement of independent managers and editors by persons who will applaud without serious qualification the fascist rule. So if we talk about fascist doctrine, the fascist had no political theory, and it was wholly empirical and practical. Mussolini had a disdain for theory, and very often he repeated, "My program is action, not talk." He exalted fascism by contrasting its reality and definiteness to the sterile theories of other movements. So, fascism, Mussolini said, is based on reality, and Bolshevism is based on theory. He wanted to be definite and real, and that is what he said. I came out with a realistic policy. It's not with discussion and theory. So, despite this emphasis on realism, fascism has certain theoretical assumptions which formulated its general social ideals. Its aim was a fundamental reorganization and reinvigoration of Italian life, and to that end, a restoration of strength and the prestige of Italian government authority. So, in the fulfillment of these aims, fascism displayed a striking combination of realism and mysticism. Its clarion call was action first, theory afterwards. The methods which it adopted in the pursuit of its ends were not fixed, as they were not based on any reasoning. They were highly flexible and could easily be adjusted and made workable in attaining its objects. So, naturally, they could not be consistent with one another. So, the state or nation, according to fascist assumption, is an independent entity with a real will of its own. Now, this real will of the state is quite distinct from the popular will, which democracy owns. So, fascist, they deemed popular sovereignty a fictitious creation of democracy. And democracy they denounced because it gave power to the masses to decide innumerable issues about which they hardly have any knowledge. So the democratic notion of the equality of men was held to be completely wrong by fascists, for it was considered as a mechanical process, that is, leveling human beings to one plane. So thereby denying to them the noble training of nature. Here it seems that Mussolini emphasized the law of the survival of the fittest. So fascism in brief not only accepts the fact of human inequality, but goes further and affirms inequality as an ideal form. Now, talking about their opinion or their belief on society, nation, and state. So, by society, the fascist meant a nation, and a nation to them was the state. So, a nation, they explained, was based on biological similarities. So, it had a life more continuous, it was more permanent, and important in the lives of its members. So, state was the organic structure of the nation. State was thus the primary expression of the fact of nationality, and it stood for absolute sovereignty, both moral and legal. So, the interests of the nation must take precedent over the individual interest and those of other groups. A war for the preservation, expansion, exaltation of a nation may be supremely justifiable, even though it may frustrate the special interest of every lesser group and destroy the lives of the nation's most worthwhile citizens. Thus, thus the fascism did not concede to the people the liberty, equality, and other rights. It rather scorned them. The individuals had rights only insofar as the state conferred these on them. So his will counted when it coincided with the will of the state. So liberty was not understood as a right but as a duty. The state and its laws were the supreme manifestation of liberty, and citizens gained true personality and liberty by merging themselves and their identities in the state. So the fascists accordingly substituted for liberty, equality, and fraternity. So three words of a higher and more noble significance, and that was duty, discipline, and sacrifice. Now, which encouraged a man to employ all his faculties in an efficacious participation in national life. So it was, in fact, a rule of few people. The basic ideal of fascism, that is, the nation is more important than any and all its members, and the interests of the nation must always precede and dominate over any sort of private interest, determine the fascist principle of governmental structures and policy. So, political authority, it was advocated, must be aristocratic in nature because only a minority of the nation has the capacity to perceive and give effect to national interest. So, it should at the same time be autocratic if it was to inspire respect and exact obedience. So, sovereignty was not vested in the people but in the nation state. Only the few selected had the right to speak to the nation. Now, these selected possessed the ability to sacrifice private interest to the national welfare, and they were capable of pursuing the right way to that end by virtue of their inherited character and cultural training. So they were therefore considered supreme guardians of the destiny of the nation. To reduce it to a simple formula, fascism claimed that only the few could rule, only the few could make decisions. When there was leadership, there was virility. Government by the elite is a principle of fascism, and the concept of leadership expressed the extreme form of elite principle. The violence was considered as power, and the fascists had always been explicit in defense of violence as a means of achieving political aims. So, fascism is totalitarianism in its means, and it uses any form of coercion, from verbal threat to mass murders, for obtaining its ends. Mussolini defended the destruction of property and maiming and killing of people as practically and morally necessary. Following the suppression of the general strike in August 1922, he said after having made use of it, that is the violence, and that was systematically, for 48 hours, he got results which we should not have obtained in 48 years of sermons and propaganda. So when therefore violence removes, according to him, the gangrene of this sort, it is morally sacred and said it's necessary. So this violence employed during the period of revolution remained the essence of Mussolini's policy both at home and abroad. So his creed was that of a man who was willing or unwilling or unable to be ruthless despot was not fit to be the head of the state. Force must be used to whatever extent a ruler found it necessary in guaranteeing the prestige and stability of his government and maintaining order and efficient action in economic life of the nation. So what we surmise from all the discussion we have done so far is that fascism was enemy of internationalism. So fascism was it was anti-humanity, and it proclaimed is international peace, and its pursuance is cowardice and coward's dream. And imperialism, according to Mussolini, is the eternal and immutable law of life. An Italian expression, he said, time and again was a matter of life and death, and we are 40 million squeezed in our narrow but adorable peninsula. So Italy must expand or perish. So this is tantamount to preaching war. So we are charged, said Mussolini in 1925, when having imposed upon our nation a war discipline, he said, I admit it, I glory in it. He said on another occasion, war alone brings up to their highest tension all human energies and puts the stamp of nobility upon the people who have the courage to meet it. Then they considered economy as the part of their national unity. They considered all economic questions from the standpoint of national unity. The production, distribution of wealth were primarily matters of national, not individual concerns, because the nation must be economically, politically consolidated. The productive energies of the nation must be maintained at the highest possible point in order to supply the means for maintaining virile citizens and preserving the national strength. So the fascists therefore managed and regulated the economic life of the country while maintaining individual responsibility, the freedom of enterprise. So fascism rejected both laissez-faire and state ownership. Private ownership of property was allowed because economic self-interest was considered to be the most powerful incentive to productive activity. But this interest must be held in constant subordination to the national interest. So the fascist government was within its right to intervene at any time and in anywhere whenever it appeared to them that private initiative had failed in serving the national security and prosperity. Now the concept that they came up with was corporate, and from there the word comes corporativism. So originally the fascist party was favorably inclined to syndicalism, and it had advocated the right to each syndicate or the trade union or workers to take over and manage production within a particular field of its own activity. But from 1926 onward, or even earlier, it turned its original syndicalism into a new form of corporativism. Now, it proclaimed the doctrine that in each branch or category of production, a corporation should be established. And there were two features of this corporation. In the first place, it was to be composed of syndicate, that is a trade union of workers, and syndicate, that is the association of employers. Now, concerned with that branch of production, so in the second place, the corporation was not to take over and manage production within its branch to the exclusion of private property and private enterprise. It would simply regulate the working of private property and the conduct of private enterprise under the aegis of the state. So, state was to guide all the activities of the corporate so created. Now, organicity was another feature which they said was unique to them, and that simply talked about that corporativism was based on organicity. The completeness of life of the nation in its totality is what they called organicity. Now, since the nation must work as a totality and as a series of conflicting groups' interests need to be smoothed out, so here the corporatism defined both liberalism and socialism that were prevalent in the world around. So the former, that is the liberalism, made the individual an end himself, whereas the latter, that is socialism, attempted to place the allegiance of workers within all other workers throughout the world. So fascism insisted that the allegiance of both employers and workers must be to Italy first, and the class concept of solidarity was resolutely denied. So, no worker in the name of class loyalty can impair the general productive power of the state, and no employer can injure the workers and consuming population in the interest of a profit that is pernicious from a national point of view. So, the government, the symbol of organic unity of all, must insist that the objective national allegiance is preserved. So the corporative state was what which came on to fore at the international level. So various laws were passed from time to time for organization of corporative state. By 1934, the structure was complete and the corporations were vested with legislative powers and fell directly within their competence, and each corporation was headed by a cabinet minister, and it provided a basis for coordination in national economic activities. And by 1936, Mussolini announced the end of Chamber of Deputies. From 1928 to 1939, the corporations provided a list of parliamentary candidates, which, after revision by the Grand Council of the Fascist Party, was submitted to the voters of the national electorate. So after 1939, the corporations themselves served as an electorate and elected the members. So in this way, the corporations directly provided the great majority of the members in the new chamber of fascists. So this fascist party thus enunciated the doctrine that the corporation was the proper basis for any system of national representation. Now, this was the answer, as Barker says, to the Democrat who thus saw his cherished system of quantitative representation on a territorial basis displaced by a new so-called qualitative system, which professed to elite the last element of the nation through the sieve of vocation and the method of choice. Now, if we look at the achievements, what Italy has gained through this corporativism was claims made by the Italian system was that the system has lavishly brought about the life of people. It has improved their status. So it is claimed that it provided new conception of function of the state. It is superior to the laissez-faire and socialism, as it reconciled the state and the individual to one another by reconciling them both to the point of corporation. So in the corporation, the producers and the workers find their expression and conciliate their differences, the state standing by them and aiding them in their task. Secondly, the corporativism is or can be distinct from any political regime. A totalitarian state is not only its climate, although it's the Italian product. So finally, this concept is the democratic device of the 20th century. That is what they claimed, and by reconciling, by reconciling the differences of all factors of production in the field of economics, it brings them to a common pedestal and introduces a new system of representation which does not depend on geographical constituencies or ever hostile to political parties, but on the essential national cadre and their complementary interests. Now, in conclusion, if we see the claims made particularly by British admirers of Italian corporativism, that it is not essentially connected with a totalitarian state and that it can be independent of a political regime is not tenable. Even the Italian theorist and statesman had never made such a claim, except once by Mussolini, when he had said that the concept that he has generated was a part of the general development of the world's economy. But Mussolini had also maintained that genuine corporativism was required the system of a single party and state ruled by the elite. So authoritarianism is the long Italian tradition of government, and the fascist state was totalitarian. So the system was therefore not a source of popular representation. It was neither a pattern of industrial democracy nor an alternative to parliamentary democracy. As such, there was no justification in characterizing it as a new style or form of democracy. Now, if you see, it's another version, the totalitarian state in the rise of Nazism in after the World War. First was claimed to be a fight of democracy against autocracy. That is what the World War First War was labeled. So it was hoped that after the cessation of hostilities, the world would emerge safer for the growth of democratic institutions. But soon after the Treaty of Versailles, nearly three-quarters of the people of Europe found democratic governments either destroyed or in danger of destruction. So Italy was the first to experiment with a totalitarian state after Mussolini's famous march on Rome in 1922, and followed the defeated Germany, which had presented to the world the best specimen of a parliamentary government through Weimar Constitution. The unsettled economic and political conditions in the Germany did not provide a satisfactory climate for parliamentary institutions, nor had she any democratic tradition. So she was groaning under the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Deprived of her colonies, committed a program of heavy disarmament, officially forbidden by the treaty to raise a German air force for years to come, and huge reparations which she had not the means to pay. So Germany had become a third-rate international power after the First World War, and within Germany itself there was a complete economic collapse. The flight of gold from Germany and the reckless policy of inflation resulted in inconceivable depreciation in the value of the mark and unprecedented rise in prices. Now, there was widespread unemployment, and the number of 1932 unemployed reached around 6 million. Now, that was the time which led to the emergence of totalitarian state, and the Germany under these circumstances could not be content with this sheer democratic constitution, and she was in need of an indomitable leader. So no matter liberal or reactionary, who could steer the ship of the state out of the moorings of economic and political chaos. So then there was a restless nationalistic fervor throughout the country, and it was at this psychological moment that Adolf Hitler appeared on the scene. Now, he was skillful in playing with the emotions of the people. He promised to destroy the much resented Treaty of Versailles. He secured military equality for Germany, repudiate reparations, expel the Jews who throve on the misery of Germans, both during the war and after the suppressed radical labor movements, provide employment for all, and take vigorous steps to pave down inequalities in the process of and in the possession of wealth. So Hitler's appeal was for all classes of population. Hungry people wanted unemployment, hungry people wanted food, unemployed wanted employment, and then the labor needed work and security of employment. So landowners and the industrialists were in search of someone who could guarantee them their wealth in the face of spreading communist ideology and methods. So Hitler's movement to start with was known as German Workers' Party. And next year it was named National Socialist German Workers' Party, and later the National Socialist Party. So the change in the party name was relevant to the need of the time and psychology of the people. So National Socialist label was sufficient to enamor both socialist and nationalist, and that led to the acceptance, and the propaganda machinery that worked further provided them legitimacy. So Hitler rose to prominence through his own talent, and Hitler was appointed chancellor with a cabinet of Nazis and members of the center and old nationalist group. But he secured the dissolution of the parliament, Riksdag, that is called, and elections were proclaimed to be held on March 5. But a few days before that, there was a mysterious fire which consumed the Riksdag building. So that was held to be the work of a communist who it was alleged had flashed the signal for general rising. So it exasperated Hitler and his Nazi party, and in the opening election campaign, Hitler denounced the crime of 1918, that is Treaty of Versailles, and the crime that was committed at the end of the First World War, and unequivocally promised to destroy Marxism, communism, and class warfare. So he He was an avowed opponent of parliamentary democracy as well, and accordingly committed himself to end it and find the way of reorganizing the new unity of German nation. So, what we find here is that by March 1933, elections were held, which the Nazis and their nationalist allies won by a slight majority of 2% vote, and that's how he came into the prominence. Now, if you see the structure that was created by them, the structure and policy of the Nazi state, that is when the Riksdag met on March 28, it gave blanket power to the Nazi cabinet under Hitler for a period of 4 years. So it is from this date that the typical Nazi program was put into operation, and the accession of power of the Nazis was widely acclaimed by Italian newspapers as a sign of the collapse of another democracy and as a vindication of fascist creed of strong and autocratic action. So Nazis too had in the aim and tactics approached nearly the Italian model, and the government soon dissolved the communist, socialist and other opposition parties, and law was made making the National Socialist Party or the Nazi Party the only legal party in the country. Opposition newspapers were suppressed. The press, the radio, theatre and cinema, they were all censored, and they only propagated the ideology of Nazism. Talking about the policy, thousands of political suspects were imprisoned, driven into exile, and their Jews excluded from public life of the party and the government. So the ideal of Nazism was basically one Reich, that is one parliament, one people, one leader was achieved. Thus, in rapid stroke, the Nazi achieved a totalitarian state. And then the story continued that one single instance illustrated that the November 1933 election, the new all-Nazi Riksdag held a 7.5-minute session for the sole purpose of electing officers. And the brown shirters seated there, they rose and sat in unison when the government's list was put on to vote. So the parliament had become just an approving body to what the decision was taken at the level of leadership. Talking about the doctrine, Nazism had no well-defined doctrine. It was not either a philosophy of the theory of the state or government. It was just a movement which responded to a restless nationalistic fervor and aroused by resentment over the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, although its appeal was in conformity with the political heritage of the Germans and the psychology. So Hitler was an imperfectly educated man with no flair for philosophy or political theorizing, but he had probably never read any the writings of Hegel or Chamberlain, yet he endowed with great native gifts and trained in the methods of playing with the sentiments and emotions. So he preached valiant action and popularized veneration for the great national tradition. As a result, he did not had liking for universities, and universities were reduced to mere propagating the ideology of Nazism, that is the militant warlike heroism. That is what they wanted to promote through universities. So Nazism practiced the gospel of the victorious sword and the principle of might as right. So the state that was created in Germany was exclusive state. It was exclusive. That meant two things. In the first place, it advocated the purity of race, the purity of language, the purity of literature. And further, with its extreme nationalism of the Nazi, it may be connected as a tense devotion to German paganism in religion and the theory that the German women are considered valuable only as a bearer of pure Nordic children and the preserver of the exclusiveness of the state. And in the second place, it meant the achievement of economic self-sufficiency. So the leader of the party decided what to produce, where to produce, how to produce, and when to produce, and private determination and choice had nothing to do with it. So both the producer and consumers had neither any choice nor any preference, and there was no separate organization of the labor, and the strike and lockouts were strictly prohibited by law. And then state was considered as a mean, so not an end. That was a difference that we find vis-a-vis the Italian version. Nazis did not glorify the state to the same degree as the fascists did. Hitler rejected the Mussolini's idea that the state is a spiritual and moral fact in itself. So state was not regarded as an end, but as a means, and its highest purpose was to preserve and promote racial unity, racial purity, racial development. So Nazis transmuted in the nation what they had denied to the state. They agreed to the dictum of Kant and Fichte that individual possesses no rights but duties, and the true freedom of the individual, they claim, consists in subordinating himself to the nation and working for its welfare. Then, when the individual has no right, no freedom of choice, and no private initiative, it matters not whether the exaltation is that of a state or a nation. The results are the same. So, Hitler was the head of the German nation as well as the state. Now, they had antithesis of democracy. They did not like the parliament, the representation, people's right, their voting, or their equality, and the political parties were abolished, and they got rid of the method of voting and the decision by majority. And party was an agent, and it was an agent to promote the interest of the leader, and the Hitler was the head of the party, head of the state, head of the government. So head of the German nation considered as a racial community, obedience to leader was declared a sacred duty, and this was rigidly enforced by arts and discipline and propaganda. And there did not involve any question of how and why. Duty, discipline, and sacrifice were the watchword for the German citizen. And leader was supreme. Leader was thus more in Nazi Germany than just a matter of authority from above. It was the instrumentality through which nationality was state, and all political processes were fused into one of the national leaders hailed as the supreme embodiment of spiritual and will of the people, and hence the infallible head of their political system. So totalitarianism therefore acquired a sanctity in Germany that was never attained in Italy. So if we very quickly see the elements of similarity in Nazism, Fascism, and Communism, we find that the element of single party in common with the former Russia having a communist party and fascist party in both these countries. Then social economic policy were common. They were based on executive eminence and the power and responsibility. Legislature have been reduced to a subordinate position in all the three versions, and just to register the will of the executive. That is what the role of the parliament had been restricted to. And that was an idea in all the three versions of totalitarianism. We find the ideal of a closed society, restoration of the old heritage of the directing leader. So Nazi party mixed an old nationalism with a non-proletarian socialism. And it drew, all the three versions drew their followers from all the ranks and all the station in life, all those who desired national renaissance, they all joined their mission. So socialists appealed particularly to the peasants, small shopkeepers, and the low middle class. Apparently, they wanted to appeal to the youth to join the war. So National Socialism went to the people and the community. Basically, the purpose was to drive out foreign elements. They concluded by conceiving German community as a native and natural race, and communism too is based upon a few common ideas that has been expressed so far in these two versions of totalitarian state. So emphasis, they all emphasize the common interests of the workers in all the countries. Commonality was not found on this sector because the workers in other countries, the communism wanted them to unite, but the fascist and other forces, Nazis, they basically did not align with this concept of other countries joining their mission. So it aims at the international revolution of the proletariat, the communist basically, and the doctrine and practice of corporativism that we saw in Italy. They had a general appeal which could be advocated to others and adopted. That is what they were common in, whether Nazis or whether fascist or whether the communists. They all considered their economic system to be the best in the world, and they wanted all other democratic countries to adopt theirs system of economic prosperity. So here what we find is a version of state that was very harmful to the humanity at large, although they themselves called revolutionaries, but they were less of a revolutionary than the destroyers of the humanity, especially the individual, its rights and its freedom. So with that, I come to the end of what I wanted to present in the totalitarian state part 2, and that was the fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, and its comparison to some extent with the communist regime in erstwhile USSR. So thanks for watching. Thank you.